Thank you, everybody, for showing up and doing this. My name is Steve Jagger. I run the speaker series at the tennis club. This is a bit of a different version of the speaker series. The speaker series was designed basically to bring in interesting speakers to talk to members and guests on a whole bunch of different topics. We had Jesse scheduled, and then the COVID-19 world broke out and changed everything. And so instead of canceling the event, Jesse thankfully agreed to do it online, which kind of makes sense for a social media talk, I think. And instead of adjusting how the fee structure works, we basically pivoted because most people showing up at the club would normally get a drink and some appetizers. And so what we did is we partnered up with the Zajac Foundation and the Zajac Ranch. And so we're donating, all the proceeds will go to the ranch, which at this time is also very helpful for them because all their main fundraising activities have also been canceled. So thank you everybody for coming. A couple things that I do need to do is we do have two sponsors. The MCL Group sponsors all of my speaker series at the club. Normally they get a bit of a fanfare at the events, and their signage is everywhere. So I wanted to make sure I acknowledge them because they are good to continue with this sponsorship, even though it's a bit of a different setup. And as well as Providence Security also is the event sponsor. So thanks to both of them. There is the Zajac Ranch. If you guys want more information about them, it's zajacranch.com, and you can dig into it. And without further ado, let me just introduce Jesse Miller. So Jesse is a thought leader in the social media space. Sorry, I'm just letting somebody else in here. Jesse's a nationally recognized speaker in the field of digital literacy, new media, and advocacy of social media education. His social media awareness programs consistently deliver up-to-date, balanced, and relevant resources that reflect real-world concern of social media use. His focus on the trends in mobile technology as it applies to our working and learning environments where private content becomes a conversation for the public, and how the use of application-based technologies have shifted our communication landscape. So without further ado, I'll let you take over here, Jesse. Thanks again for doing this.
Oh, I appreciate it, Steve. And it's wonderful being here with people. I mean, obviously, we're all in a very unique situation where odds are some of you have already had a Zoom conversation today for some professional purposes. As a speaker, having the public is a privilege, especially when people take time out of their day to come and watch you. But as a public speaker, not being able to get together with the public is a bit of an identity crisis for me, because I have the privilege of traveling all across Canada and to be fair, around the world, talking about the internet and the impacts that our children are experiencing, our families are experiencing, our relationships are experiencing. And as an educator in British Columbia, where I've delivered presentations for 15 years talking about this topic, I've been privileged to not only participate in curriculum development, but also being able to have a very unique vantage point to some of the more provocative incidents that have made us all aware of how children are using the internet, some of the concerns that come to our front page of newspapers, whether it be bullying, cyberbullying, whether it be threats to safety. And so unlike any other profession, I've been very privileged to be involved in a number of incidents that have given me a unique perspective that I can deliver to parents, so that we can open up a dialogue about what our kids do with technology, but at the same time, how we as individuals set a tone, and whether that's in our workplace, our family homes, our relationships. This is an ongoing dialogue. But just to kind of add a little bit of levity to what I would say is right now an extraordinary circumstance, I've gone through a bit of a process in my own reflection since COVID-19 has shut down everything that we kind of treat as normal, because most of the presentations I usually do, I have parents who come up and say, I'm really concerned about screen time. I'm really concerned about the apps my children are using. And I think that sometimes those fears are misplaced. And so more importantly, what I'd like you to think about as we're having our conversation today, and as we go through some slides on my end, is what has the past, let's say, 45 days look like with the technology that we sometimes malign? Has the use of a screen become necessary compared to an entertainment escape? And so what I'd like to do is we're going to go through some slide content, and I have to do a bit of a slide share, so forgive me for a second as I get up. But as we discuss, I would like you to consider your children what they're doing right now, how they're using the technology that they have available. And as we go through that content, just consider where we would be without this. What would your life look like without having the ability to be online and not only getting access to education materials from your schools, whether they be independent or public, but at the same time also just consider how much of a silver lining having Netflix might be for that Zoom call that you've been on where your children just need to be quiet for 45 minutes. And the reality of it is that we as parents have relied on the internet in a variety of ways. But if you have a child who's, let's say, middle school age, maybe early secondary, that child is the same age as your iPhone, as the idea of the iPhone exists, because the iPhone is about to turn 14. If we think about Facebook, it would be graduating high school this year. And so a lot of these platforms and technologies that we use on the daily for our family connections, our work connections, or even our interpersonal connections, our children right now have grown up with that being normal. And that normal, it's unfair of us as adults who grew up maybe without it to really kind of malign their use. And now we think about this pivot that we're all experiencing. What does it look like to rely on the internet as a tool, not only for convenience, but as a utility to get things done in this circumstance? So within that, as an educator, I love tech. I love social media. I think there's so many wonderful pieces of it that bring the world together. We're more aware, but at the same time, there's also those negatives that we will touch on today. But as an educator, I very much try and go to the positives before I go to the negatives. So what I'd like to do is just keep one thing in mind with tech, is that social media itself is part of our technology revolution in the 21st century. When we hit 1999 and we were worried about Y2K and everything kind of shutting down, 2000 rolled into this new era of going from these kind of static lumbering computers to more fluid laptops, mobile devices that allowed us to stay in touch for business. If any of you still have a BlackBerry, you probably still only work for the government. But in that, the idea of how 21st century technologies were going to become something that were disposable. Every 18 months, we would see a new lineup for people buying phones and people talking about this brand new app that everybody's sharing photographs on. Facebook really did take the world by storm in the mid 2000s, and it became so much of a commonplace tool that it's now interfered with aspects of democracy. We probably have friends who have small businesses where they benefit from using Facebook, and odds are you might have a friend who's selling something on Facebook and you just kind of want them to calm down. But within that, as parents, we are a new generation of parents who very much are dealing with media at every angle, whether it's that countdown on Netflix that we really wish gave us like a minute as opposed to 20 seconds, or when it comes down to it, just the idea of every telecommunications commercial we see has focal points of everybody in the house being able to stay connected without any kind of interference and lag time. So I'm a big believer that the parenting role that we have now is attached to not only our own reflection of how we use tech, but when it comes down to it, how we set a tone and how we guide. Because yes, we can justify checking emails at 11 o'clock at night while laying beside a partner in bed. But the reality of it is most of us check because it's convenient, because it's accessible. And so if you grew up where there are times where people were really shut down from work and say going on a vacation and not dealing with work stuff, we all have these abilities now to justify how we use tech. And I think that that's part of the parenting piece as we kind of think about our kids moving forward using this. How do we find healthy balance? So within that, let's just take a quick second to reflect on social media itself. There are so many social media platforms, and as I'm delivering this in English, just bear in mind that there are social media platforms that you've never heard of because they operate in different languages around the world. But maybe, just maybe, when we think about the way that these tools get used, as a whole, our entire planet, we as human beings probably weren't ready for the social media revolution that occurred. We weren't ready for on-demand content. We weren't ready for our lives to become broadcasted. We weren't ready for the idea that a mistake that traditionally would stay in a small community now is the first thing that comes up on Google when somebody searches you. So within that, let's add a little bit of humanity to the social media fabric. The idea that we are all fallible, that people make mistakes, and that a child who makes a mistake online really does deal with a lot of anxieties, because what they've heard is that you have to be perfect on this platform. You can't make mistakes. And I think that's an error in early social media education, because we had these fear-based presentations that really rooted in there are pedophiles out there, there's scary people out there. If you make one mistake, if you bully a person, you are going to be not hireable and you're going to lose a scholarship. And I think in the past 5 years, we've seen a little bit of leeway to how extreme some of those lessons have been and what it means to be a human being in this space where you are representing yourself as a digital citizen as equally as a citizen. But when we think about our own values of citizenship, we all make mistakes in some way, shape, or form. Some of them are more profound because we got caught, because there was a person holding you accountable, or because there's a family dinner where some family member reminds you every year of that one thing you did when you were 17. Within that space, just put yourself in the shoes of a child today where that one photograph taken and sent to a friend is now part of a group chat. It's part of the fear that tomorrow when they walk into the building, everyone is going to be talking about it, but everybody's only talking about it 30 seconds after the photo was shared, because that's the reality we live in, where on-demand content is readily available. So within that, I don't want you to struggle as parents to consider how to know everything about social media. And as you look at the slide here, you'll see that we have our 5 pretty much everyday access platforms in North America. We have people watching videos on YouTube. We have people sharing things on Snapchat. We have people checking Instagram well before their feet touch a bedroom floor as they start their day. We have people who are maintaining Facebook and Facebook Messenger connections, or they're using WhatsApp to stay in touch. Facebook itself as a company, they own 3 of these platforms: Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram. But if you consider how interconnected they all are, a Snapchat chat that's shared between 2 friends is now being shared on Instagram because someone's taken a screenshot. If you use WhatsApp as a primary communication tool, it's encrypted on both sides, it's secure, but it's still owned by Facebook, which means they probably saw some kind of value in having the ability to host that information. But if you consider what your kids are doing, what's next, you're never going to be an expert on what's next if you're not talking to your kids about their own interests, because there is a fear that some parents have that they just don't get it, so they should just lock it down. But there's always going to be something new. There's always going to be a new platform. And to be fair to that point, a lot of those platforms are created by kids who are just kind of curious about how they can build the next thing. So I'm encouraging anybody here participating in the session who are worried about your kids online, don't hesitate to talk to your kids about their internet experience as equal to what their school experience would be. How was your day at school? Well, obviously, right now things have changed, but how is your day at school traditionally would have a kind of a censored version of events. They would talk about certain things that have happened or what happened in one class. But if you've got a good connection to the school community, you might have heard a couple of things that maybe your kids aren't revealing to you. Talking to your child about what they did on TikTok, or what they saw on a Twitch stream, or what they shared on Instagram with a certain group of friends as opposed to their wide audience. The more you talk about the way that children use technologies, the more you might understand the very interesting sociological and cultural differences and how one group of kids might interact with each other and how they might present something else to the entire planet because they're more comfortable sharing one photograph with 20 people, but a live video with anybody who wants to watch. Interestingly enough, though, in this regard, I think you have to understand what your child is capable of in that space. And they are learning in our current curriculum in British Columbia, not only how to be media engaged individuals because we have media programs, but also how to use digital citizenship as a core competency to move themselves forward. So within that regard, I just want you to keep in mind, I have no idea who's participating and how old your children are, but we could just introduce a simple question. Is, should your child have a social media account? Now, we all have our own biases and our own fears, but the reality of it is that I'm not a huge advocate for every child being online. And I'm a huge advocate for the child themselves knowing how their story is being told online. And this goes to the core value of parenting. What does it mean to tell your child's story to a random group of strangers versus close family? Or what does it mean to indulge in a conversation with 2 friends and find some support with one another as you raise children? But then at the same time, knowing that your child's story, if it got out to the public, would be an embarrassing moment for that kid. I want you to understand that we as parents, we do have a responsibility to make sure we curate aspects of our child's story in a healthy way. So the question of should your child have a social media account isn't about their own presence online where they have their own account. It's should you be telling your child's story openly online, not knowing what this will look like in 5 years and 10 years and 15 years. But if you look at the article that I'm referencing here, it's a great question. Should your child have a social media account? But the sub-headline is the key one for me. We have a statement, not a point of reference, not research. It's a statement. Kids are focused on photos, fans, and followers, like it or not. It means that as a parent, for some reason, you don't have control over this. Now, as a kid growing up, my dad had ultimate control over what I watched on TV because he'd walk in the room, take the controller, change channel, and say, we're not watching this. But he didn't have control when I wasn't supposed to be watching TV. When he was at work and I got home and I had 3 hours before he walked in the door, I could fib and say I didn't watch any TV, but my dad and I played chess. He put his hand on the back of the television. He'd feel it. He knew it was hot. And I didn't know that TVs actually radiated heat. So, I mean, you have to learn lessons at some point in time. But he would play this game of chess to see if I was being honest or not. I want you to consider what it means for our children to be online, where we automatically have this normal that's associated to them overhearing us. Oh, I saw that on Instagram. Oh yeah, I saw that person post something on Facebook. Them being online is about them knowing what's being shared about them, but also them understanding that we tell our stories online all the time. So this author is structuring a statement into a great question. And to be fair, it's nothing rooted in good research. It's nothing rooted in good data. It's opinion based on maybe just the idea that we have to protect our kids in online spaces, but doesn't that mean we have to protect our kids in all spaces, whether they be online or offline? And I think the core value there is if your kids can talk to you about anything that's happened to them offline or online, your parenting value is really strong because your kids know they can talk to you. Most of the instances I see involving kids where there's a suspension being involved or there's a big concern involving police, most of the time the kid doesn't feel very comfortable talking to the parent because there's a fear of rebuttal, especially when core values have already been given, like don't go to this website, I don't want you behaving like this. And the second something happens that's out of the kid's control, they're kind of afraid to talk to mom or dad about it because they think there's going to be a consequence with punishment associated to the behavior. So within that, if we think about this idea of why it might not be smart for kids to use social media, especially at that middle school age, there are a lot of things going on in a developing kid's world where all of a sudden you're 11, 12, 13 years old, those hormones are firing off, you've got all these things going on, peer pressures, and you're trying to figure out how to fit in. And the reality of it is that there is good research to show that we should be limiting how often and how much content is being shared and being accessed by kids in that age group. But the reality of it is that when they say this subheadline of tweens' brains are simply too immature to use social media appropriately, I just want you to take a second and think about that adult that you have in your life who you know that their brain is simply too immature to use social media appropriately. It's not an age thing, it's a maturity thing. Does the person understand context? Do they understand how their words may have negative impact? Do they understand that maybe the information they're sharing is misinformed and it's rooted in a bigger issue like, oh, I don't know, disinformation campaigns that are designed to divide us as a society? And more so than ever right now, this is an important dialogue. Are we sourcing good information? Are we seeing family members falling into conspiracy theories? What does it mean to find good info online? And odds are children in your life might be better at finding that information online that's verifiable than maybe a person who's 60 plus. So as you consider this, I want you to just know a couple things about kids and tech these days. We needed 15 years to figure out whether or not kids themselves were being negatively impacted or positively impacted by how they use technology and associated social media. And it's unfair to say, but a lot of the studies and things like that that usually get big headline news are rooted in very small sample sizes and are not rooted in good data. So within that, when we have, let's say, unfortunate circumstances involving kids in social media and there's a lot of headline news, the stories that don't get published involving that, like the background police investigations, the family impacts, the impacts on people who may have been seen as cyberbullies, that data now is emerging 5 years, 10 years, 15 years later, and we're learning a little bit more about not only the mental health impacts, the developmental concerns, or at the end of the day, the family dynamics that go into each individual story. So the study I'm showing you on the screen here, this is from January 2019. This was a very, very in-depth research piece that looked at how we approach those questions, like, is mental health a negative impact for kids using social media? Question there is, and this goes to the majority of adults who are participating in this event, if you had a high school counselor who really never asked you how you were doing beyond grades, extracurriculars, what your next step was for the future, if you grew up in the 70s, 80s, 90s, no one was really asking you about your mental health. But now, every school I ever visit, we see plastered against walls uh, uh, resources for kids so that they can go and not only talk about how they're feeling, but look for resources that maybe don't exist in their home because that adult in their life doesn't want to hear about that thing that the kid's experiencing. So within that, when we measure mental health assessments, especially as it applies, pardon me guys, I'm losing my lights here for a second. As we apply this to how we collect data, it turns out that a lot of the kids who are using social media tools are actually having really good experiences. And yes, there is a small percentage of kids who are having negative experiences, maybe in one instance, but the kids who are having long-term negative incidents, those kids, unfortunately, are usually dealing with some unassessed mental health issue that really could be solved as a whole when it comes to the approach at the school level, at the community level. So within that, when we see these wide sweeping statements of 9 out of 10 girls are facing negative mental health issues because of Instagram, that might just be the group and the sample size that was assessed and not taking in all the other socioeconomic factors that might apply to a totally different group of kids using the exact same platform on the other side of the planet. So once in a while, we have to consider where we see these headlines and how we break them down. But this is one that I use in every presentation I ever talk to high school kids, because we're looking to assess that bias. Now, I love this headline because it says a philosophy professor argues kids should use more tech, not less. Now, I don't know if anybody on the Zoom chat here has studied philosophy, but if you got a degree in philosophy and if you grew up in my home, the question would be, great, will you be living here for a while? Because the concept of what a job would look like and what it meant for you to be able to be employable after high school, after university, usually came with some kind of responsibility. So I've actually had parents say, well, what does a philosophy professor know about kids in tech? Well, the reality of it is this professor is also a clinical psychologist. And that clinical psychologist looks at how the developing brain uses technology and relies on it. And there's so much more than just the headline. So one of the things that Dr. Jordan Shapiro references in his work is, as you parent, are you engaged in what your child is doing with these tools? Your kid likes to play a video game. Great. Do you play with your child? Do you understand all of the pro-social participations that go into that game? You think it's just a game where people are blowing things up, but do you understand that your child's grouping with 4 other people and working as a team to pro-socially participate and engage that dialogue? See, the more we ask questions about how kids use these tools, we usually get to a point where we have to ask the question, at what point is too much? Well, the thing is, we've unfairly unpackaged quantity of time with quality of time. And this is right now our reality. If your child right now is getting great resources from their school, they're engaged with their friends, they're not really being negatively impacted by the fact that we've all been kind of thrown into this kind of, ocean of discontent with our everyday normal, maybe the tools are helping your kid. But the reality of it is, I think we're going to see a bit of a pendulum swing. We're going to see kids who are looking for recess. They're looking to be able to go out back with their friends. They're looking for the everyday engagement of a classroom where you don't have a parent walking in and looking at the screen going, so what are you working on now? But that's part of what it means to be a learner who's evolving. And in university, you're going to have kids who maybe at some point are using these tools entirely different ways. So when we think about what our curriculum does for screen time, it introduces ways of collaboratively working. So you have a student who's working on a Google Doc project, but now they can message the other kid and say, hey, I'm working on this right now. Do you have any resources that I can use? As opposed to, I left my homework at school and calling 10 friends and trying to figure out if somehow you can get a copy of it. The reality of it is that when we think about all these things that expose our children to the media connected world, we all have different family values. We all have different personal values that sometimes bump into these new ways of connecting. And it might not meet a narrative that works for our family home. And to be fair, it's your family home. You get to dictate that. But there is good data out there that shows that some of the fears we have are entirely unfounded. This one here, violent video game engagement is not associated with adolescents' aggressive behavior. This is one of those studies that I wish wouldn't have to be conducted. But every time I hear parents say that they see a video game they don't like, they automatically assume that their child is going to become violent because of the game. And to be fair, the majority of the issues that we see involving, especially in the United States, guns and violence in schools, not a lot of those kids play video games. They're dealing with unassessed mental health. So within that, I'd like you to kind of take this middle ground and just know that 2020 for me started very optimistically. The reality of COVID has changed the way that screen time in my house is being looked at, because we don't measure based on quantity of time, it's quality of time. Did this help you today get some schoolwork done? Did this help you explore something? And at the end of the day, did playing a video game with your sibling make that situation, the situation we're living, a little bit easier to navigate? And if it's raining, well, it's raining, and we can only do so much because there aren't a lot of friends to play with. But that's the thing. Maybe this instance will allow us a little bit more understanding of where we should be introducing regulatories. And that regulatory, especially when it comes down to the idea of what it means to hear a number, I unfortunately hear parents say, I don't want anybody to say more than 90 minutes a day or more than 2 hours. Screen time itself is something that I think we as adults can connect with. If you're at work and you spend 6 hours a day looking at a screen for the purpose of your job, that quality of time is for the purpose of work and putting money in your bank account. But if you get home and you've already checked your phone 30 times because there's a balance of text messages from kids, email stuff that's still at work and it's still kind of going on, or at the end of the day, you have a family member who's reached out to you through FaceTime, there's so many different measurements. And then when everything's said and done and you can sit on the couch for an hour and have a glass of wine and watch some Netflix with your person sitting beside you on the couch, and then you fall asleep, well, at least you're able to use the screen as an excuse just to be comfortable and not be thinking about all the other stuff. But here's the thing. Before COVID and before we got to this point of doing everything kind of remotely and adjusting to this reality that we're all living in, if you had ever sat on a couch watching something you really wanted to watch and you looked over at your partner and they were just on their phone because it was easier for them to not participate in what you were interested in, our kids watch that behavior. And it's easier now not to participate with your kids because we have an out. And so the next time you're being tortured watching one of those Pixar movies you've seen 4 or 5 times, I encourage you to just watch what your kids are experiencing in that. And how often do you get a moment just to watch your kids totally relishing something? If you keep looking at your phone, you might miss out on a lot of really great moments that your kids actually are exuding in your own home. But again, that thing that your friend wrote on Facebook might not necessarily be a priority, but it feels like it because it's there. So within that, just a quick kind of technology lesson for everybody. If you've ever seen one of these requests of you, they're called CAPTCHAs. They allow you to verify that you're not a robot. I want you to understand that technology itself, there are these kind of versions of how we use tech where people get really, really nervous. Like you were talking about something and the next day you're getting an advertisement on Instagram because you were talking about it. That's how it works. And you have to understand, you bring this into your home. You bring these tools into your home, like Alexa and Siri. And when you talk, they listen. And I say they as if I'm applying a person to it. It's a technology that we actively use for convenience, but we don't necessarily know how it works. And then we're surprised when it does. But the CAPTCHAs are interesting because if you've ever been frustrated by these because you had to answer a couple questions to prove you're not a robot, that's a security protocol. And I'm glad they exist. But 40 million of these instances of verifying information happen every day. And this tool, when you look at how we answer questions, are sometimes redundant. This one here, click all the fire hydrants, you're a logical person. That logic should tell you there's no fire hydrants in the air on top of a traffic stanchion. It wouldn't make sense. But the system itself doesn't know that. Most of us think there's a programmer who's programmed everything into this system so that it knows the answer. It doesn't. It works in variables and how often people answer a question or how often they skip it or what they most likely will go to based on all the times we've answered it previously. Thing is, every time you click one of these squares, you're actually teaching an artificial intelligence how to operate a self-driving car. It's using the cumulative data of millions upon millions upon millions of our perceptions of what a crosswalk looks like, what a building looks like, what a boat on a trailer looks like, so that one day our kids will get in a vehicle that they won't touch the steering wheel to, but it will drive them from point A to point B without getting into an accident, without merging in a stupid way where the drivers on the other cars go, what's wrong with this person? Or at the end of the day, where it doesn't fall asleep at the wheel, because the vehicle will get you home safely. Maybe after a couple glasses of wine, that might be the smartest way of getting home. So within that, 2020, it's a really weird year. But I started 2020 delivering these 3 themes to my audiences. Do we talk about our digital identities with our kids? Do our kids understand that their digital identity might not be in control because by the time they hit 10, their parents shared hundreds of photos of them online? Digital rights. What does it mean to be allowed to be forgotten because of a mistake you made as a kid? And do you understand your rights online as they apply to you as a person in Canada who has charter rights, but maybe you don't understand that those rights don't necessarily fit into an international internet that doesn't have boundaries? At the end of the day, digital literacy. Do we understand how these tools work? And are we happy in the way they've been set up, or are we just content because they work? So within that, I talk to kids and I talk to adults about how we use networks, whether they be our social ones where we want to tell the world what we're up to, how we're feeling, where we're going, our professional ones because we're looking for a job and LinkedIn is a lot better than walking around with 500 business cards in your pocket, or your personal network where you want to send something to family and friends, but you don't want the entire world to see it because it looks a little bit awkward when somebody at work Googles it. See, the reality of those network pieces is that there is a big safety piece. We should be talking about our network connections. We should be talking more and more about the people who can come into our life and not only take our value from our family, but at the same time, maybe the things that we consider to be valuable to our family, like our safety, or the perception that maybe our computer wasn't compromised by some random person because a password was violated. Or at the end of the day, that your kid's playing a video game against somebody on the internet who you don't know, but that person doesn't have any ill will. They just want to play a video game as equally as your kid does. So within that, when I think about security of self, I'm encouraging every participant who's watching right now, if you have the ability to, change your passwords during this time. Go into some practice where you not only change passwords, but you have different passwords for every single thing you do online. Why? Because it's easier to steal from you from the comfort of my desk than it is to try and get into your wallet or try and steal a bag. The reality of it is today is that if you use the same password for everything, once one of them is compromised, everything's compromised. And if any of you have ever received any of those emails where there's a threat to who you are and the pictures will be sent to all of your contacts, odds are they don't have anything about you except for one little privacy breach. That doesn't mean that your home computer was violated. It just means that they're testing the waters to see if they can get you and make you send some money. So today, when we think about this communications, health, and wellness, I know at this point right here, some of you may have actually just said to maybe to yourself or aloud, this guy thinks I'm going to be able to maintain 15, 20 passwords. If you can remember your old phone number from when you were a kid, your brain works. We just have to test it once in a while. And we have to challenge it where maybe once in a while a pen and paper is the best way of maintaining something to not only control, but to guarantee safety. And whether your kids learn that habit now during this outbreak where we have a bit of downtime at home to put in some good healthy practices, health and wellness shouldn't just be about putting a phone down. It should be about learning how to find good balance where it's the quantity of use and that's being criticized, and the quality of time and how we use the tool is being embraced. So here's one thing that I always ask kids, and it's difficult for some parents to face because we don't want to have to justify things in our family lives some days. But I know that when I was growing up, if I challenged my dad, there would be an automatic kind of butting of heads where his response would be, "How dare you?" But the thing is that, and I think about this always, our kids watch us use technology to book an airplane ticket, to look up friends and family, what they're doing on their trip. That's all changed. I mean, I've watched more friends baking bread on Instagram than I ever have and ever even imagined I would have. But when I first heard my daughter ask me what I was doing on my phone and my response was almost defensive, I realized it wasn't her criticizing me, it was her being curious. And that curiosity is multifaceted. But the thing is that me replying to an email, me checking to see if I have a Twitter notification, or at the end of the day, getting a text message from a friend because they just want to see if we can get together on the weekend, that's normal. The reality of it is that we use our tools for tech convenience as a crutch. And so what I hope you would reflect here is that if we set the tone, we shouldn't be hypocritical. Our kids use these tools as equally as we do in a variety of ways, and they're probably somewhat better. But it comes down to it, they're learning how to be media literate, how to be critical of media. And at the same time, that media literacy turns into digital citizenship that a lot of people in certain age brackets are totally devoid of. So within that, I want to focus just really quickly here on some discussion topics. I'm going to come back as we kind of wrap up, but I'd like you to think about some discussion topics, some questions, and you can either send them in the chat to Steve, or if you need to afterward, you don't want to send it out to everybody, feel free to reach out via email. I'm more than happy to continue this dialogue. But within that, I just want to highlight one important value that I have in my digital world is digital consent. Consent is literally the best conversation that I have ever been able to have with my kids, especially when it comes down to educating my kids about core values of consent. And not in a scary way, but just understanding that somebody touching you, somebody having contact with you, whether it's intimate, whether it's physical, should be consensual. But we've never really engaged a conversation about digital consent without really considering what it means to ask the question, and it's an awkward one, of do you mind if I take a picture of you? Do you mind if I post this online? And odds are some of you have seen friends and family sharing Zoom panel conversations on Instagram where you can see everybody's names and all that. The reality is that we violate privacy all the time. And so within that, digital consent should be as simple as, did you ask for permission? Are you sharing information online about others without informing the person? In the professional world, this is a lot of my bread and butter. I have a number of clients who literally keep me on retainer to assess how their businesses are affected by employees taking pictures in the workplace that shouldn't exist on the internet. And the biggest fallacy within that is, oh, it's private, it's my private account. No, you took a picture of a human being and put it on the internet for your purpose of selfish sharing, not for the purpose of understanding that that person has a right in the workplace not to be documented. So within that, when we think about the type of people who are screenshotting things, a lot of them are doing things in a variety of ways to leverage power. And a lot of the stories that we see that evolve, we do have kids who are upstanders. They come forward and they say, oh, I received a group chat and there's a text message here. I think the principal needs to know about it. But any of the high profile incidences involving kids, hypersexualization, sexting, it's usually that power dynamic. And that right now in Canada, for adults, I mean, you can't share an intimate image of another person without their consent if you're over 18, which means if you're in an adult relationship and you've received a photo, you showing that photo to anybody else, you sending it to anybody else, it's a violation of the criminal code. And it can be enforced if the complaint is made to authorities. So within that, when we think about illegal content and how law catches up to social media, just a couple points here. Let's just say you've got kids who are 16 years old, they're in a relationship dating somebody who's 16. 4 years later, those kids are 20 and they're still in the same relationship. And they're adults who have been together since grade 10. But here's the neat thing. Let's say they were sharing images when they were 16, 17 years old. And 4 years later, they still have those images on their phone. Those adults are now in possession of child pornography. Thing is, yeah, you consensually sent them with your partner and you've been in this relationship, but the reality of that is that as your age changes and as you grow older, the content itself doesn't. So what are you hanging on to it for? But the thing is, that's not a conversation for the dinner table. That's a conversation you want to avoid if, well, police officers going through the phone, or at the end of the day, you're traveling a border and the border officer is going through it. See, there's so many little subjective variables here. And for some families, they've experienced it. For others, they've gone through it and they've gone through the court of law with it. So within that, being a good online citizen means you're considering the feelings of others. And whether you're an adult or a child or you're an employee or employer, those dialogues really should be explored. And for those of you on the chat who are employers, that should be policy. If it's not in your policies, it needs to be written. But at the same time, just consider it. The workplace has something happen. Person collapses and everybody thinks the person has COVID. 5 people record, 2 of them are your employees. Now it's on Facebook. Now it's on the internet. Now it's on headline news. See, within that, we can share with care and the best practices and look for the best for our children. But how do we hope that the people that we share space with are going to be considerate of what could happen if something gets out? So I don't care what platform we're talking about. I do really, really, really encourage you to talk to your kids about how they use the tools. And what I'd like to end here on is gaming. I usually have an audience in front of me. So I say, how many parents here have kids who play video games? And the hands all go up. And I say, how many parents play video games? And a couple of hands go up. And then I say, how many people here play video games without your kids? And like 3 or 4 dads' hands go up. And then there's a laugh from their partner beside them. But the thing is, gaming's been around for a while, and it used to look like this. It used to look awkward, not connected, large TVs, 16-bit, 8-bit even. Now it's interconnected, and it's amazing. Esports has seen such a huge rise in the past 4 months because, well, sports is not happening. And prior to COVID, in Europe and Asia, esports was on the rise, so much so that it was being considered for an Olympic sport, not in the upcoming Summer Olympics, but the next one. But if you consider something, and this is an important value to me, anytime you ever hear a kid, playing basketball, playing hockey, all those stories about success, you get to that point of like, look how many, pucks they shot. Look how many times they're in the backyard just trying to take a shot on the net. I always hear kids talk about their opportunities, and yeah, it can lead to a scholarship, and yeah, it can lead to professional sports and make millions of dollars and all those things. But it's a very small percentage of the population who find success at that realm. But if you think about the levels that we achieve, teamwork, communication, esports has that. And within that, there's opportunity for scholarships. The University of Southern California has a master's degree program in esports. University of British Columbia has a UBC esports team. We have students in Canada who go to school on scholarship playing video games. It's pretty amazing. But within that, if we think about that participation value, the two slides I've just shown you are female dominant. If you hear a kid playing hockey and it's like, well, that kid will never make it to the NHL, or that kid might make it to the NHL. We use the word kid as if it's gender neutral, but we mean that boy might make it to the NHL. That boy might not make it to the NBA. But within that, any kid, doesn't matter, male, female, anything in between, can play a video game and find success. So within that, just consider how these tools fit into our connected worlds. This elder in Saskatchewan, he recognized a lot of his students were not graduating from high school in a traditional sense of what they would have to get done by grade 12. But he found that they were playing video games. So he used the curriculum to his advantage, got these kids in rooms, business economics for designing t-shirts and selling them, the ability to get communication credits for looking at how you participate as a team in the space. And at the end of the day, digital tech education, because they're learning how to build video games as equally as play them. So within that, I always look for these opportunities to kind of explore how big this is. The footage that you're watching right now, this is Rogers Arena in 2018. This is an esports championship. The stadium is sold out. People are paying money to watch physically inside the building. Those of you who say it's a waste of time, I want you to consider what it means to spend a couple $100 to go see a professional sports team play and watch people beside you looking at their phone. But in this, these individuals here, 18 teams, playing a video game, 3-day tournament. The restaurants around Rogers Arena, people are buying food. Servers are putting food down and getting tip outs in the middle of August when a hockey team's not playing. And the individuals who are there because they care about something. That's community. There's value to that. But they're celebrating a team that's won, and the winning team is taking home a couple $1 million in prizes for 3 days of video games. Not every kid will make it to the NHL, and not every kid will win a video game tournament. But what does it mean to have a couple of skills that you learned along the way? See, the thing is, we might say kids these days, but in Europe, well, kids go watch their grandparents in Wii bowling. And I'd like to see a lot more crowds coming together and participating, but obviously it's just what we're all dealing with right now. And I'm feeling very disconnected from a lot of parts of the community that makes me feel normal. But if I know that a grandparent in a senior's home, especially in lockdown conditions, is staying active while playing Wii Sports, whatever we can do to make things a little bit more normal, especially for those most vulnerable. So what I'm going to ask is, for any of you on the chat who are a parent, caregiver, just reconsider your approach to electronic media, especially our judgment values of it, and understand that an on and off switch isn't realistic for a connected society. But right now, more than ever, we're putting the on switch on and we're leaving it up. But if any of you have found some value to getting out as a family, going for a walk, being able to kind of reconnect, watching an old movie, there are so many things here that have really kind of given us an understanding of maybe where we put our priorities. But here's the thing. Gaming itself isn't going to lead to every kid being connected and being the best organized person in the world. But for some of those kids who don't fit into traditional spaces, maybe at the end of the day, this is something that's great for them, and it helps them connect with a community that maybe we just don't get, but it works for them. But I do want to show you something really kind of interesting to me. The small positive effects we see about gameplay doesn't mean we change curriculum. But this gentleman here, he's a little bit older, and I'm going by the hairline. He's running an excavator. He's sitting in Munich, Germany, and the excavator itself is in Seoul, Korea. We're going to see a tech revolution after COVID. We're going to see changes, and I'm glad that there's a lot of the infrastructure that's in place to make it so that people can work remotely. But we live in British Columbia, and in British Columbia, we have forest fires, and I'd much rather see an excavator being operated 100 kilometers away where somebody's able to dig a trench, make sure the fire doesn't jump, and we keep a human life safe where it needs to be. So within that, I just want you to consider how our kids are using these tools, how you use them, where your expectations are as a parent, as a partner in your family life, and at the end of the day, as an employer or an employee. But with kids, it's pretty simple. If you're starting to see red flags with how they participate in school and associated study, and I'm doing this off of our normal routines. Your kid's exhausted every morning because they're up watching Netflix until 1 o'clock in the morning. Obviously, something has to change. But I met a mom a couple of years ago who said she was so happy because she saw that her daughter was putting down the phone and not touching it, almost like a total 180 from her normal behavior. And the thing is, I was more inclined to ask the mom, what's going on with the internet with your daughter that's making her afraid of the internet right now? And she got back to me and she opened up a dialogue and she said, you were right. My daughter was dealing with an issue. Some photos went back and forth and she was terrified to look at what was on the screen today. Sometimes you got to look for the red flags that you know apply to your kid. And that change in behavior is the red flag. Don't look at it as a silver lining and finally the phone's down. But sleep or rest, participation with friends, all these things come into play. And when your kid tells you they have a friend that they've never met, I mean, I've got LinkedIn followers I've never met. I've got Twitter followers I've never met. I'm a grown adult who can navigate that. But the reality of it is, for me, is as a grown adult, I can pick and choose my battles. For a kid who's more vulnerable, I'm hoping they can pick and choose their battles, but that they also have a safe place to talk about that battle if they are dealing with it. So if your kid does come up and say, hey, I have an issue with a person I'm playing a video game with, I'm having an issue with a follower on Instagram, don't make them feel bad for coming forward, especially if you've told them about the scary strangers in the world. Know they're doing the right thing and coming to talk to you. And if they can't talk to you, make sure they have a person in their life they can talk to where you know that that person is going to give them trustworthy advice. So as we wrap and we go back to that discussion topic piece, I want to know that I want to just communicate that, you know, we know that things are different currently in our world. So there are parts of this that are a little bit easier for me to project. And there's also parts of it that I just wish we weren't having to face. But if you found good time with your family throughout all of this, you know, that might be the silver lining that's really important, because the hustle and bustle of everyday life, 45-hour work weeks, stuck in traffic, and all the things we do, they are wonderful. But I've really enjoyed being able to watch a couple of old movies from the 80s with my kids and talk to them about it. We recently watched The Truman Show, which is an old Jim Carrey movie, and the entire time my youngest was laughing, going, there's no cell phones. And I thought to myself, how would Truman have understood, you know, a smartphone technology? So just use the time to find something really positive about some of the things that we're facing. And let's open up the floor to some Q&A.
Awesome. Thanks, Jesse. There's a whole whack of questions. It's funny when you say something specific, it's like questions and then you keep moving. So I've tried to, while you've been talking, I've grouped them. The first one, super easy one, is just how old are your kids? That one came in very early.
Kids 11 and 5.
11 and 5. This one, a few people asked the same question, but I liked how this one was written. It said, isn't Fortnite addictive? Question mark. Super concerned.
Yeah. So here's the thing. You know, the World Health Organization has become kind of front and center in our world because of COVID. But I remember last year I was doing a talk and I said the World Health Organization, and we had an audience member who said, that's a thing? I didn't even know that existed. The World Health Organization takes data from across the world and looks at developing communities, developing technologies, developing issues, and really tries to put in a world guidance. And they have had some mixed issues in the past year and a half with video games, because they did introduce some dialogue about how video games could be addictive. But there was one really important caveat that they missed. They didn't highlight the type of video games that people are playing. So when I was a kid growing up, I would play Mario or Duck Hunt, Donkey Kong, stuff that was somewhat innocuous in the sense of its connected ability. But at the end of the day, Nintendo really didn't know what level I was on or how often I was playing. Because the games are interconnected, there are so many more variables now. And so we can see how many peaks there are in a day with certain groups of age groups. So we'll see a huge kick up at 3:30 in the afternoon. And that's a bunch of kids who are now online because they got home from school. So any game that has what's called a loot box, you get to the box, you can add certain things to your character, you can buy things. There is a component that gets the frontal cortex going, and it's the same thing when you go into a casino and you sit there at the slot machine pulling away on the handle. Now, if I put 50 bucks into a slot machine and I lose 45, but I win 10, I get that endorphin rush of, oh, I won 10 bucks. But somehow my brain makes me forget that I just spent 45. That's gambling. And that's why within all of our gambling, we hear that use your game sense and be sensible with this. There are certain video games that are more addictive than others. Fortnite applies in that space when you have kids who are saying, oh, I have to buy more skins. It's a idea that you're buying a variable that's going to make your character more engaging. And there's a lot of vanity pieces that go into that. But as a whole, it is about the child as an individual, not all kids, because I can go into a casino, put 50 bucks in, and I can walk away. Another person might get that endorphin rush and say, I'm taking this 10, I'm going to let it ride. So we all have different variables. And I don't know if any of you are sitting there with a glass of wine, but I can have a glass of wine right now and I could stop. I could also drink 4 glasses of wine and I'd be a little bit more groggy in the morning, but I'd be okay. Another person, that one sip of wine might take them on an entirely different path. So each game has its variables. Look for reviews, talk to your kids about why you are concerned. But yes, Fortnite can be addicting. It is about the individual though, not so much the game itself.
That's great. I would agree. It's like adults addicted to Facebook feeds or their Instagram feeds.
Yeah.
This one's a couple questions came in on it. I kind of combined them. So one is, why was Twitter not one of the icons when you talked about the different media channels? And what do you think of Trump's social media use, #Twitter?
So 2 points. One, that slide is traditionally, I put it in for high school audiences. The 5 at the bottom, I put those in there because they're the most actively used by kids in Canada who are anglicized. So within that, we see kids who use WhatsApp as a add-on for Facebook. They won't use Facebook itself, but they'll use Facebook Messenger. It's usually there's a family component within that. We don't see a lot of teenagers on Twitter. It's just a reality with it. We did in let's say the early 2010s. So 2011, 2012, we had a huge group of kids in British Columbia who were really heavy on Twitter. But also in the States, we start to see more kids, especially in like sports communities where they'll follow athletes on Twitter, but they won't really engage in politics. But you're starting to see a little bit more of a community dialogue. So Twitter gets used more actively in the States than Canada. But in Canada, our top 5 right now for youth. TikTok is huge. It's massive. Instagram would be right there in parallel. Snapchat's dropped down about 1/3. YouTube is still massive, especially within streaming and sharing content. And 5th, I mean, we can put any kind of messaging platform in that space, like iMessage or whatnot. It's not really a social media, but the reason I put it there is because we have a lot of kids who are using group chats. And group chats, I mean, they're toxic at best. If any of you are in an adult group chat, it's just exhausting. You're trying to figure out what 30 messages have been shared. So there are parts of it that can be beneficial, but there are some isolating factors that I think are a concern, especially with sports teams. The commentary about Trump, and I'll say his name, but it's like Voldemort for me. I'm scared to say it because he might show up. I'll leave my ideology, my politics aside. I'll say 2 things about President Trump. He used Twitter to its fullest capability to make people believe something. And he's very good at that. Whether it's what he's done in his business or the way he's engaged his brand, he's always been very good at making people believe that there's an engagement factor to him. And he used that platform to show there's a true value to democracy in the United States. anybody can become president, and you can make people believe something using that platform. Prior to this setting, though, I just was reading something online about a tweet that Trump had sent out involving ventilators. A person who works in the cell phone industry in California basically tweeted at him and said, "I can get you ventilators. Have somebody from your office call me." The White House coronavirus task force had New York reach out to this guy, and they gave him $62 million, and not a single ventilator has been produced. So it just shows that you can actively make the president believe something as equally as the president can make somebody believe something as well. So I think it's caustic. I do really appreciate good politics on Twitter. I don't like the politics that are motivated to make people fearful using that platform.
Gotcha. Thanks. Here's a kind of a longer one. Would love to understand the impact of social media is having on girls' self-esteem. What I see from my husband's niece is disturbing. Selfies with ridiculous to no clothes on. She's sad when they don't get enough likes, and she's only 13. What's up with the selfie culture?
Yeah, so I mean, selfie culture has been around for a while. I can't speak specifically about girls as a whole, but I can tell you kids as a whole, they've been raised with an idea that their value is directly associated to how many engagements they get. That's partially pop culture. If you have kids who are inclined to know things about Kardashians, if they know things about entertainment television, if they are inclined to watch a YouTuber, there is celebrity. And that's the neat thing about social media, is that it can take anybody and make them famous. Now, I'm not going to knock down the business acumen of Kardashians, but they really rode dad's coattails, O.J. Simpson trial, all the way to reality TV, to social media in a very effective way. And each person in that family has a different way of approaching it. My favorite would be the youngest, Kylie Jenner, in the sense that she's got a makeup line. She was kind of peripheral in the TV show. But social media culture is about influencing, and they influence well. Now, here's the thing about selfies. Like, I'm comfortable being in front of a camera here, but I'm not comfortable as a grown man holding a phone in my hand and taking a selfie. It's just, there's an awkward feeling to it. And I look at the picture, I'm like, oh, is that the way I look? Is this what's going on? And only because if I was at a bus stop and you saw me posing and taking pictures, I feel like I would deserve ridicule. But that's just the way I grew up. That's the way I was constructed as a young man. Like, oh, don't worry about how you look, just go out there. And the thing is, when I see kids who are empowered with how they tell the world their story, that's significantly better than when I was at 13. And a quick example, there was a young girl in Washington State about 5-6 years ago. I think she was probably 16, 17 at the time. She, unfortunately, even today, has debilitating cystic acne. Now, I can remember being a kid where you walk into class and you have a pimple and you think it's the worst thing ever and everybody's gonna be looking at you. Now, this kid goes every day feeling like the world's paying attention to this skin condition that even a person with bad skin would say, oh my goodness, I'm so glad I don't look like that. Now, what she did for about 2 years was she posted on Instagram how to do makeup cover so that kids with cystic acne could feel a little bit more confident walking out the door. In 2018, she pivoted entirely and started doing no makeup selfies. And she showed the world what she looked like without having to put on layers and layers of makeup. So within that, she went from having about 1,300 followers on Instagram for these selfies involving makeup to having over 500,000 followers of kids from around the world who were dealing with the same issue every day, not feeling great about how they face the world. And we all know that we live in a culture where you looking perfect is just the way that people expect in certain ways of our own development. So her empowerment then became articles that were written about her. The audience themselves would start posting like zit of the day. And there's a lot of empowerment that goes to that, where the kids themselves, and I'm not going to say that the question itself has some judgment, but you know, the idea that you go to the supermarket and you see, you know, magazines that have people wearing less to no clothing. It's part of our culture. And if our culture is structured that way and we have a different value, we have to meet our kids where our values are, but also where their influences may be. So talking to kids about why that is, you know, photoshopped, why that person looks perfect. What does perfection look like in a different way? And how is success measured? The more that we put strong people, especially women, in the forefront of our business communities, in the front of our politics. You know, you can be a person who isn't measured because you're wearing a certain size and you look a certain way. And that's the hard part, is that I mean, I'm raising a daughter who's in that space myself, and she has her moments where you can see she's trying to compare herself to other people, but she has an intrinsic self-worth that I really think is rooted in the fact that she not only heard me, you know, emulate strength in my own family, talking about her strong grandmother and her strong mother, but at the end of the day, that the people on TV aren't the measurement of worth. And so the more that we talk to our kids about why we tell our stories online, why we take selfies, why we share our values, I think the better kids are going to be. But that said, me putting a roll of Kodak film into a camera and taking 24 pictures and dropping the film off at London Drugs and coming back a week later and then handing out the photographs to my friends would have been egotistical, narcissistic, and people would walk away and go, what the hell am I supposed to do with this picture now? We pivoted because it doesn't cost us any money. And taking 30 pictures to find the perfect one is part of that culture. So within that, I used to use an example where I tell, you know, parents, if your kid was, you know, costing you 10 cents for every picture they took with the phone, at what point would you intervene? Is it the idea of teaching value, or because the value is now, you know, disappearing from your pocket? You have to kind of think about that in two different ways.
Awesome. So I just, conscious of time, I've got 2 questions left. And I just got a note here from Carmen Zajac's on the call as well, and she's thanked everybody for showing up and for the donation that's coming their way. So 2 questions here. One is, well, this one's a sort of a short question, but probably interesting one is, okay, I've heard how bad TikTok is. How bad is it?
Yeah. So here's the thing with TikTok. TikTok used to be an app called Musical.ly. It kind of crashed down. Kids weren't into it as much anymore. The company that bought it is based in China. There are some huge national security concerns with people using TikTok and that information being hosted in China. Not only just the conflict with government, but at the end of the day, what does it mean to have information about soldiers, politicians finding its way into the hands of others? We don't think that as much with the Americans, but the Patriot Act allows anything on Facebook to be accessed, which means if you're a Canadian using Facebook, anything you wrote on Facebook could be accessed when you're entering the United States, or traveling or applying for immigration, things like that. So let's take away the national security piece. TikTok, there are a lot of really positives about it. It's a really healthy community in some ways. But like anything, the more that the community gets attention, the more toxic it might become. So 6 months ago, if you asked me, do you like TikTok? I would say yes, because there's a really great group of people creating amazing things there. And I'm really inspired to see the collective positivity. But at a whole, and maybe kind of prelude to the question earlier about why kids might be drawn to it, there is an affirmation piece to it. You get a lot of attention, you get a lot of people commenting, you get a lot of people sharing your video. So within that, if you're concerned about your kid being kind of believing that they're famous for something, you make sure it's something that they're really proud of and that they can confidently show you as a family. We are seeing some kids who are putting a little bit too much out there on TikTok, whether it's language, whether it's explicit content. And TikTok does have moderation, but it's not the same as what we've seen with 10 years of Instagram.
Cool. So I lied. I've got 2 more.
Okay.
One just popped in. So this one just said, you've been speaking mostly about older kids. Can you comment on how do you bring kids into the social media world?
Yeah, so I've got kids on 2 parts of that spectrum, middle school and primary. The idea of family social media accounts is key, I think, in that. If you are introducing some kind of use, I don't like the age gating where you say, oh, you have to be 13 because the rule says 13. That's so the website is compliant with collecting child's information. But if you as a family set up an Instagram account and your 9-year-old is watching it, if your 7-year-old wants to post something and it's a picture of the dog, things like that, at least you're working as a family, you're sharing together, you're working cooperatively. And if you do bump into anything along the way that you might not think is appropriate for your child, you can then introduce the conversation. I've met too many parents who have kind of put a hold on their kid being on social media, then the kid gets on and there's almost like this floodgate that opens up, and then you're trying to kind of put everything back into the bottle as much as you can. Your kid is going to bump into things on the internet that you as a family are not going to be happy with. But at the end of the day, if they're comfortable talking to you and they understand the home values, that's key. And I think the earlier you introduce that value, the easier it will be as your kid ages.
Awesome. That's a great answer. So last question, which is kind of a good way to wrap it up, is how do parents model good internet use and online behavior?
We'll start with just reviewing what you've written and post online. I mean, there are so many things that get written online where I look at it and I'm like, I cannot believe a grown adult who has a job and their job is right there on Facebook and it corresponds with LinkedIn would write that. And Twitter is partially, where I see that kind of content. But here's the thing, it does go to how we justify. If you're sitting on the couch and watching something with your kids and they're totally engaged, but you're checking emails or you're on Facebook, you are modeling the behavior that you don't want to see out of your kids at the dinner table, at the bedtime routine. If you're watching something and your kids are on an iPad on the side and they're not engaged, again, they'll turn around and say, well, I watch you do this all the time, so why can't I? If you text and drive, which you shouldn't do, your kids will watch you. And then when they get a ticket at 17 for texting and driving, how dare you sit there and chastise them because they watched you for 10 years at every red light, check your phone. So within that, I don't think I need the punishment of a ticket to model good behavior for my children. But that said, 6 years ago, I got a speeding ticket. My daughter was in the car. Since then, I remember it every day because you just become complacent. You become routine. To be fair, it was a drastic change in speed zone, but I should have paid attention to the sign. So see my justification, I would have argued for the judge, but I accepted it and moved on. So within that, consider what it means to go on a vacation and spend time as a family. Again, the future normal. But if you as a family right now are finding some solace in being able to find isolation in certain moments by using tech, make that the norm now and say, hey, we're going to take a couple moments in the day just to participate one-on-one. And then we're going to do things as a family and set some tones that really do work for all of us.
That's awesome. So we're a little bit over time, and I know everybody's probably either going to dinner. Normally you'd be at the club and you'd be going to the bar to get a drink and some snacks, but I want to thank you very much, Jesse, for doing this. I just popped your website link in there.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have recorded it and I've put your email in the chat as well, so you may get some questions coming your way. But yeah, thank you very much, and thanks everybody for attending, and thanks for supporting the Zajac Ranch.
Thank you all.